And we're live. You're with Pastor Brett and Pastor Larry talking about Easter. And you just said today is Maundy Thursday.
That's correct. Not Monday, Maundy.
Monday.
And it's from the mandate. That's the Latin word for mandate, which means Jesus gave a commandment to his disciples on that evening when he washed their feet. And Brett, what was that commandment?
Love one another as I have loved you.
Exactly. So that's interesting. There's not many mandates that we take from Jesus, but this is one that we think is not a bad one.
That's what makes the whole creed system that the church evolved into kind of strange.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, but Easter is the greatest time of the church, and I don't know if I've said it in this podcast before, but it's quarterback. I get to be quarterback on Super Bowl Sunday, and this is Super Bowl for the church. It's the greatest time. People come who've never come all year long, and we get the opportunity to tell the greatest truth of all, and that's that the Spirit of Christ is alive today, and it still is making a difference in the world. And the celebration of Easter is not something that just happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that happens regularly because we celebrate the presence of Christ that changes the hearts of human beings and transitions our lives and transforms us. And I mean, that's the story that has to be told and told and told because that's where the action is. I think that's where the power is.
Yeah, no question.
So you sent me an email this morning, and I read that. And I thought that was really interesting, especially coming into Easter. It was a story that my grandfather, or your father-in-law, who's now passed, wrote about an experience that he had when he was 14 years old. And what year would that have been?
1932.
When he was 14?
Yeah.
Okay. And he went to some sort of revival or something of the sort with his family. And he had this road to Damascus kind of experience.
Right.
And really crazy to read this. My grandpa in the 30s that went through this experience and then wrote it down, and just what that was. And it really reminded me a lot of the Easter event. Mm-hmm. This thing that happened in the Easter story that really started all of Christianity in some ways. I mean, I know there was more to it than that. It's not like the thing just organically happened right after that, but that this was kind of the thing that birthed this religion to come to be, and how we're still looking back 2,000 years later and saying and trying to figure it out and talking about it and debating on different aspects of it. And it's wild to think that there's this one event that happened that had such an impact.
Right.
And I think it's what you said earlier. You said that the Easter event is not something that just happened 2,000 years ago. It's something that happens over and over again, and something that's happening today.
Right.
And it happens in your life, and it happens in my life, and it may happen on a day-to-day schedule or a weekly schedule or a yearly schedule or once a life, that we have these events where something new comes to be, mm-hmm. and something has to die first. So here we are back to the dark aspect of it.
But I think you can't have a resurrection without a death. And I think that, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ really are one thing. They're not three separate things. Because
what do you mean by that?
You can't separate the life, death, and resurrection of Christ and break it into different points of meaning, because his life that he lived and the teaching that he taught culminated in his death and also culminated in this resurrection. They should not be separated. And some people would they focus on just a part of that. For example, if I just spend all my life, I wear a cross around my neck, and everything to me is about Jesus died, Jesus died, Jesus died. Well, you're not getting the whole thing. And if you go around all the time saying, oh, bless God, God's Spirit's here. Don't you feel a spirit? It's all spiritual. Then at some point you got to say, but you got to look at this whole life, death, and resurrection. It's a whole package, and you need to take it all. And you need to understand that part A affects part B and C, and they all together are so much more powerful and exciting than any one separately would be. So when people get hung up on A, B, or C, I want to say, hey, you got to look at the
There's
whole.
There's a balance of
the whole thing
of three.
Theologians call that the Christ event, the life, death, and resurrection.
And to separate
actually, they'll start with the incarnation. But yeah.
And to separate those things would be.
It's just not doing full service. Mm-hmm. You're not giving the whole picture. You're choosing to just, I talked to someone the other day, so, it's the Spirit, the Spirit, the Spirit. And, and I'm okay with talking about the Spirit. I think the Spirit of Jesus is alive and changing humanity. But at some point, but the Spirit reveals to us what His teaching said, to love one another. So to say, well, His Spirit's in me, and He told me to go out and rob a store or whatever. That's not really
right. It has to be in line with the teaching.
It has to be in line. Mm-hmm. It's consistent.
There's a checks and balance.
And truth and honesty and integrity, all these things are part of the package that Jesus, that comprises His life. And I think that they should be always held together.
So do you see these three things coming out of balance in today's kind of Christianity? Do you see
yes.
some people or some facets of Christianity focusing too much on the life or the death or the resurrection? I don't feel like I see it much with the resurrection. I think everybody gets together on Easter, and it's kind of the unified thing that everybody's...
But that would be the Spirit. That's the opposite.
Okay.
For example, in the early days of Suncoast, we used to say we're based on 3 C's: casual, contemporary, Christ-centered. And there's some churches that are very Bible-centered, very Word-centered. It's all about where you worship the Bible. It's very literally understood. And I understand that. And there are others that say, oh, no, we're Spirit-centered. And they're usually charismatic churches, and it's all about the Spirit. And I use the analogy of a fireplace. I see you go into a certain Baptist/Bible-based churches, and their fireplace, I'd say theologically, man, they got every brick in place. Good Baptist churches, good Bible-centered church, they got all the bricks in place. You go into a charismatic church, there's a bonfire in the living room. There's no bricks at all. It just burning. But you go back to these other Bible-centered churches, there's just a little wisp of smoke. And one of the things we've tried to do in the balance is say, we're not a Spirit-centered charismatic church, nor are we do we worship the Bible. We are a Christ-centered church, and Jesus is a central message. And if you want to find out about Him, you need to read this book. And if you want to see Him working in your life, you need that Spirit that still lives. But the focus is on Him, you get all three.
Yes.
The focus on one or the other, the right or left, I think you tend to fall off the scale that way.
I totally agree. And not only when you're Christ-centered, you're also centered on humanity too. So he connects that dot as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's good.
No.
I hadn't really. I've heard you say that before, but that never really resonated like it did just now. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, sometimes you have to say it a lot of times.
Depends on who you're talking to.
You're talking to me. Sometimes I'm listening.
Yeah. Well, you were much younger when I said that quite a bit, so I understand where it could not be followed. But I think important in life is balance. And I love to talk even the resurrection story, and I love to throw a little controversy in there to say, well, was it a physical body? Was it no body at all? Was it a resurrection body? And what does that look like? You know what the answer is? I'm glad you're listening. We don't know.
Right.
We really don't know. But we do know the impact of His Spirit could not be killed. And whether it's a physical body, resurrection body, people, man, they would die on that hill. I simply would say, the Spirit of Christ is alive today. That's a better hill to die on. It's better to say that. I believe. I do think it's amazing to look at Mary Magdalene go into the tomb, crying her eyes out, and He's not there, and she grabs the gardener. She thinks, she grabs Jesus and thinks He's the gardener. Now, here's something to think about, and I've never heard anybody say this, but what if it was the gardener?
I just heard somebody say that.
And the Spirit of Christ came, and what if on the road to Emmaus, all of a sudden, He's in the stranger on the road to Emmaus?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you begin to realize that Christ can be anywhere, in any person, at any time. And 2,000 years later, there's nothing more true. All of a sudden, you see Christ in us. And you just go, wow, this is amazing. In just a moment, something wonderful can happen. And I'll tell a story. My buddy Paul Short, who died a few years ago, Paul was 72, gave a lot of musical instruments to the church. He was he was gay, and he was very quiet about that, but he was a recluse, and I'd been my friend for over 20 years. I was the executor of his estate. And when he struggled toward the end, he was going blind, and he lost vision in one eye, and he just could not. He's so independent, and he just did not talk to anybody. I mean, he'd go for months and not talk to anyone. And losing his sight, he realized he would become dependent, and he couldn't live that way. So he took some pills and got in a tub and drowned, and he took his own life. And the police officer showed up on a Saturday night church and said, "Are you Larry Bauckham?" "Yes." "So I got this note for you," and begins to go through all this stuff. And Paul had written me a note saying, but in that note it says, "But you know I'm a Christian, and I love God, and Jesus lives in my life, but I just can't live in a world where I'm so dependent on everyone else, and I've chosen to do this, and God understands." And I looked at that and go, that's amazing. And I was telling that to a friend of mine, Barry Brown in San Francisco, and Barry said, "Let me continue the story for you." He said, "Do you think he's with God?" I said, "I do. I think he's in the arms of a loving Father." He said, "Let me tell you another part. When he saw Jesus, he said, 'Oh, I'm so glad to see you, Jesus.' He said, 'Paul, I've been waiting. I'm glad you're here.' He said, 'But Jesus, there's something so familiar about you. It's your eyes. I've seen your eyes before." And Barry said, "Yes, Jesus." Paul says, talks to Jesus. He says, "I've seen your eyes, the same eyes that my pastor has."
Yeah.
I just started boohooing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I just thought, wow, when we can have the Spirit of Christ in us, to where we have his eyes and we have his heart, I think that's the Easter message that happens in all of us. And it's born again. I mean, it's death and birth and resurrection and transformation. All these words come into this whole thing, but it's a celebration of the great things, because we can live a life that truly helps other people, a life that's the best possible version that we can be.
Mm-hmm.
It's a life that where Christ is, the Spirit of Christ is in us and helps us be better. Make sense?
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
Well, I don't even want to go any further than that.
I know. I was just thinking to myself,
You want to try to follow that
that's
up,
just a
Brad?
really great way to end things, isn't it?
Yeah.
yeah. Well,
I did, but maybe it's for another.
We can.
You want me?
we're gonna, next week we're going to have a post-resurrection appearance.
Oh boy. All right. I think that's how we're going to end it. And our card's flashing red. So
Okay. Thanks guys for your input.
thanks for being here. Have a good one.